Hello there, and this is Mike Knezovich, and welcome to the latest edition of Tune Up with Mike and Monty, Brain Science Step by Step. Today we're going to talk about brain development and function behind perspective taking. Perspective taking is a pretty important part of being a human being, and we'll be talking about that. The we means me and Dr. Mani Pavluri. We are here on a autumn Chicago day, and how are you today, Dr. Mani?
I'm doing great, Mike, and happy autumn to everybody.
If you've been here before, you know that each episode we talk about how our brains function and what can go wrong and why and what we can do about that. Today we're going to talk about perspective taking and how we get the ability, how we gain the ability to take different perspectives. So we're trying to understand the mind and the brain development function behind perspective taking. Maybe first we just talk about, I think we all kind of know intuitively what perspective taking is, but it's probably worth at least explaining what that means to you, Doctor.
Yeah, sure. Perspective taking is essentially understanding others' mind and responding to people around us. Usually it's like responding to the biological stimuli, right? The people and environment around us in relation to other people's minds. Mm-hmm. The most important thing to think about in this context, I think, is brain undergoes maturation in teenage, or overall until, you grow up. And there is psychosocial development that is also occurring in cohesion. And there is genetics, again, that is, and the genetics influence hormonal milieu, that influence, again, the social behavior. So it is a amalgamation of multiple mechanisms that underlie how we gain the perspective and develop our brain in understanding other people's point of view.
So when I'm born, I don't really have this ability to take other perspectives. I've got my own and that's it, and I'm just waiting for my next meal and all that stuff. But you're saying that over time there's a biological component that has to do with maturation and development.
Of course. And also, children actually become increasingly self-conscious and preoccupied with other people's opinion about them. And that becomes, of course, very intense in teenage. Yeah. And they become increasingly aware of their friends, teachers, and the whole society's perspectives. And all of this involves intense socialization process, right?
Yeah.
And such socialization process makes people become so self-obsessed in a way, For example, my son, who would have been in teenage until recently, or still is the last one, who would say, he asked me sort of not to talk too much when the friends are around. He's kind of embarrassed about what they would think and how he should be coming across to other people, and that he is so, he thinks he's like sort of unique. So these are the normal processes of social development where kids develop a certain idea of understanding, and then they almost always have an imaginary audience, in teenage.
That? Imaginary audience. That's an interesting term.
Yeah, and this is where, Elkin's theory comes in, where there's increased self-consciousness in teenagers, and regardless of whether there's a real audience or not, they always think very self-consciously, and they, feel pretty unique and special. And that's part of development, and along with the sense of self that develops and what they think other people are thinking, and trying to get an understanding of self and others along the process and mature, the brain also is developing at the same time overall. And so there is a brain development overall. Perspective is important to understand, and also the specific perspective of brain development that underlies especially the perspective taking. And they both are, of course, interrelated and interconnected processes.
Mm-hmm. And this is This development especially fast or intense during adolescence, or is it kind of on a continuum from birth?
It is a continuum from birth, but what is interesting is that the most acute changes occur in teenage, for example. And actually the gray matter. We talked a lot before in other podcasts about the gray matter. That's like the cap of the brain, and then there's a white matter connections. Where the white matter is covered by myelin. That's just like structures that connect all the gray matters. Structures. So and again, what happens in adolescence is that the volume of gray matter in frontal lobe increases, and it reaches in children, and it reaches a peak around 12 for males and 11 for females. So you understand, females develop faster, right? So, and it roughly coincides with the age of puberty onset. And this is followed again by the decline in the volume of gray matter also. And this is a work done by Gade and Sauvel, Gogte, and others, So in late, 1999 and 2003, 2004, around that time, they're all published. And this going up and going down of prefrontal cortex. And similar process occurs in parietal lobe, which is like the two cones on the back of the brain skull, under the two cones of our skull, like the parietal lobe at the back of the brain, and on the side back of the brain, you understand, the two cones of your head. So underneath it. And this parietal lobe also develops to the max at 12 years of age for males and 10 years in females. And then there is a decline in the gray matter volume. Okay,
and that's the decline even is during adolescence. It's
beyond, beyond the 10 and 12 years of age. And temporal lobe again peaks around 16 years. Like temporal lobe is like the medial side part of the brain, and that peaks around 16 and then declines also. So that's the lobe that's very involved in memory and also perspective taking. All these structures are super important in perspective taking. So that's why I'm specifically mentioning frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and temporal lobe that have significance, And then the white matter of this brain also increases in density in prefrontal cortex, parietal cortex, through adolescence, and also keeps on developing, unlike reduction as in gray matter.
Oh, it continues to develop.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
And the white matter is the stuff that, for lack of a better term, kind of wires the other stuff together.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And it's myelinated, so the messages go faster.
Okay.
Yeah. And there is also cellular changes, though, which is called histological changes, in the brain. And what happens is all these synapses, it's almost like, you gather say you're writing an essay, you gather all the words and all the detail, and then you make it pithy and concise, right? In the same way, the brain, it gathers all these, it connects to everything, and it has a lot of synapses that the network that develops, and then it prunes all these synapses later and only take those that are required, just like the words in an essay or the sentences in an essay that you edit.
So it develops these connections, and then it has a mechanism that sort of evaluates whether they're useful or not and gets rid of them?
Exactly.
That's pretty amazing.
Right. That sprouting of synapses and then pruning, just like how a tree is grown and then you prune the tree. In the same way, all this brain cellular changes occur, and this gray matter increase and decrease somewhat parallels and reflects such changes at the cellular level as well.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So the brain is becoming more and more efficient, actually. And, this is reflected, clearly in the way that these scientists have measured the brain structure.
So, does IQ have anything to do with this, or does it have anything to do with IQ, I guess is another way of putting it?
Oh, intelligence quotient of the brain. I mean, it's sort of like, a measurement of various brain domains, right? And their function and your ability to, to estimate your function. By the way, I wanted to say this before I deviate to explain this, is that now the IQ is not based on numbers in measuring intellectual disability, by the way, in new DSM classification.
That's
I just
interesting.
wanted to say that.
No,
We're also hooked on these numbers.
Yeah.
But anyway, between 3 and 29 years, a longitudinal study was done by Shaw, which is published actually in 2006, where there is like a change in cortical thickness. In actually, what happens is in superior frontal gyrus, that is the gyrus, or the area, the little area that is above the brain and on the medial side of the brain, in the center, on the top, that actually undergoes a great shift. And in intelligent children, the highest IQ people, or the children with highest IQ, had thinner cortex in early childhood, and then the thickness increases rapidly, and then peaks at 11, and then it again goes thinning thereafter. So there is a little bit of like going up and then going down.
Okay. Also
in this middle part, in the front part of the brain, called superior frontal gyrus, that correlates with the IQ somewhat, and that could be related somewhat to the brain development.
Okay. Maybe we go back to this term that I liked before, the imaginary audience. I think I understand it intuitively, but why don't you expand on that, because I want to make sure I do.
Yeah, right. So, imaginary audience is nothing but, teenagers becoming self-conscious and thinking around that people are all noting them and noticing them and taking perspective of other people. And it's still not really totally mature as to what others are thinking, but it's a very fine-tuning, like searching for meanings and figuring things out, right?
Okay.
And so what is really beyond that, I think, in general, when you take a broad perspective of, when you talk about broad classification, Mike, this is how people have been talking about it, and I like to expand on, let's say, there are always these great people who have done work before our talk today, right?
Right.
There is Oakley and Fink in 2003. They have really done this amazing classification of perspective taking, called first-person perspective and second-person perspective, and they call it at a phenomenal level, okay? We need to really change from the egocentric point of view. It's almost like translocation of egocentric point of view from first-person perspective to third-person perspective, which is required in order to understand other people's mind. Okay, so now I'll tell you what first-person perspective is, okay?
Yeah.
So there is Willis Tower, right, in center of Chicago, in the downtown.
Formerly the Sears Tower.
Formerly the Sears Tower, for those who know it as Sears Tower. It's the tallest building in Chicago.
Right.
So, so you are on, I will say to you, Mike, Willis Tower is, south of where I live.
Right.
Okay? So that's my perspective.
Sure.
If a third-person perspective is, oh, Mike, Willis Tower is north of your house.
Right.
So I'm thinking about you.
Right.
Okay? So I'm understanding how you would think where Willis Tower would be from your point of view.
I got it.
Okay? So it's a visuospatial kind of similar kind of understanding.
Sure.
So, and then I have to, so if you had to understand minds, I have to shift from my point of view to your point of view. And, I actually have a very beautiful practical life experience of telling you about this. Say we have conference call, right?
Yeah.
I'm in academia, right? So we have a lot of conference calls with this and that. With various people on East Coast, West Coast. Sure. Being me in the Midwest, okay? So other people would say, oh, it's let's have this call at 3 p.m. EST. And I said, what? What is that for CST? 3 p.m. That is like 2 p.m. for me. Right. I have to figure it out.
Right.
But, I always would love to say it is 3 p.m. EST, your time, your EST. I'd like to say it that way.
Yeah.
So it's like I'm showing empathy to other people.
Yeah.
Rather than just say where they're at and how you go figure out where you are.
And I have a feeling that we've all encountered problems because we have not included that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the finest thing, and now actually Doodle does it for you. And then another example is when we all write papers together with the co-authors, and when it is cited, then we share the citation. That usually the first author sends the citations to your co-authors, and when you do that, when the paper is published, then usually you bold your name and you write it in your CV as a citation. When you send that citation, I would unbold my name and bold the other person that I'm sending that citation to, so that they can put it in their CV. So that kind of fine thinking of how I would like to operate is where I'm shifting from first person's perspective to third person's perspective.
Okay.
You know what I mean? I'm very fine-tuned to other people's thinking needs as well, and thinking and what they would do. So that's kind of like an empathy. And also perspective taking is different from allocentric perspective.
What does allocentric mean?
Allocentric perspective is actually the frame of reference is different there, where you think that Willis Tower is in the center of Chicago. It's nothing to do with you or me. Okay.
Right. Okay.
It's just like
it's kind of the big universe kind of thing.
Yeah. They're able to kind of figure out, is this line left to the square or right to the square, kind of, rather than the square on your right or my right. So it's that allocentric view is probably kids with like autism spectrum disorders might be thinking more in terms of allocentric way, perhaps.
I see.
And less as in shifting from 3PP, 1PP, like sort of first perspective taking in the first order to the third person perspective. So that's where the empathy and understanding basics for you.
Yeah. So, and one quick question. What are the, how do I put it? What are the roles of white matter versus gray matter in developing this perspective taking and empathy?
Right. Well, maybe we should think about like brain function and brain networks underlying mentalizing or perspective. So an easier way to understand is the brain function, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so functional neuroimaging studies, I have actually shown that, it's very interesting. Let's keep it really simple.
Yeah, yeah.
So the
less.
the less is more. So the medial prefrontal cortex, the front of the brain, and then the inferior parietal lobe, which is like a side bottom of the brain, beneath your cones, inferior parietal lobe, and then superior temporal sulcus, which is called STS, on the sides of the brain. Side, STS, the superior temporal sulcus on the side of the brain, and inferior parietal lobe at the base of the, side and bottom of the brain, and then front of the brain. So these three are essential aspects of mentalizing network, and they are operating in tandem. And mentalizing is, again, coined by Emodio and Frith, Utah Frith from UK, who I have the joy of listening to when I was training.
Mentalizing, what does it mean?
Understanding other people's perspectives.
Oh, it's the same thing. It's another term for
and
it.
It's another thing is theory of mind too, understanding what others are thinking. So mentalizing refers to inferences we naturally make about other people's intentions, their beliefs and desires, and then we then use it to predict and make sense of their behavior. Yeah, and so this is highly circumscribed, actually, this mentalizing network, and consists of prefrontal cortex and then the side superior temporal sulcus, and also especially around the connection between temporal lobe and parietal lobe called temporoparietal junction, and also the amygdala, of course, our good old amygdala that offers emotional perspective of what we are understanding. All of this is related to also another word that we use favorably at this time is also social cognition. So social understanding of the brain,
Okay.
the brain.
Mhm.
This mentalizing involves all these regions, I think, and yeah, and they're
You,
all, yeah,
you had mentioned this is a lot of stuff, and I
yeah.
think we're coming up to our time limit, but there's something I think we might have to pick this up in part two.
Yeah, I think.
But you mentioned autism, and I'm curious. So this is related, as far as we know, the ability or the inability to take perspectives to autism.
Of course, I mean, autism involves, of course, difficulties in social
Right.
interactions and
Okay.
also communicating, and they also have restricted pattern of interests and behaviors. So autism is actually a little bit more complex cluster of symptoms where perspective taking deficits is one aspect.
One
of
aspect.
it,
Okay.
right? So, I mean, we can also talk a lot next time about developing perspective, how people will differentiate self from others, and anticipating
Yes.
others' thinking, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And how there is a preference for social stimuli versus non-social stimuli. All those amazing things that are involved, even in perspective-taking development, and how that applies to autism. We can talk about it another day.
Yeah, we'll talk about it in the next episode, and it's amazing. This is stuff that we take for granted, and well, that's the brain. We take it for granted. But
I know, but I think that's the beauty of it, right? I mean, but the thing is, the one thing, the most important thing we can end this saying is empathy is so important, and trying to understand others' perspective in their shoes, what would they like, or in their shoes, what they're thinking, and what can I do to make their life better in every single interaction that we have with others in our society, people, personal circles, and everything else is my pet thing to think about, So therefore, understanding others' mind is so central to our quintessential existence.
you couldn't say it any better than that. With that, we're going to sign off, and we will talk to you in the next episode where we go to part 2 of perspective taking. Thanks, Doctor.
Thank you, Mike. Bye, everyone.